how do we care for bees? What is the purpose of the beekeeper? What are the benefits of keeping your own hive?
So as a beekeeper, unfortunately, due to a lot of the pests and parasites that we have, that honeybees have, the biggest problem that we face is a mite that actually gets on the backs and underside of the bee. Used to be thought that it fed on the hemolymph or the blood of the bee, but now we know that it feeds on actually the fatty tissue inside the bee cells. This mite is, if you want to liken it, similar to a tick that would get on you. It feeds on the bees, the developing bee, which causes the bee to hatch out, and with deformities such as deformed wing virus, where their wings are all bent back and they can't fly, so those bees will never be productive. Feeding on the bee, it malnourishes the developing bee, but then also, like a tick, it would they vector all sorts of nasty viruses. And so the biggest thing for bees is, as a beekeeper, is mitigating those. We have natural and chemical options to treat from varroa mites. We have a way to different testing methods to see what the level is and determine whether it's at a point that we need to intervene on behalf of the bees. And that's one of the biggest things that we deal with as beekeepers is keeping those mite levels to a low, so that we have low prevalence of viruses in here. The other thing that's part of the term that a lot of people hear is colony collapse disorder. And to an extent, that's part of it, is the viruses and the mites themselves feeding on the developing bees. The other part of that is, for what homeowners can do, is not spraying everything down with pesticides and herbicides. A lot of the home chemicals people use in their own gardens, like carbol dust or Sevin dust, even though the bee isn't actually trying to harvest that, but when we're putting those on our vegetable plants and the bees are going there to collect pollen, when the bees fly, they're very hairy and their hair becomes static charged. And so when they land on a plant, even though they're not trying to pick up the Sevin dust, that static charge will pick it up, and so they bring it back to the hive. So pesticide application and the chemicals that homeowners use can be a problem for bees. Mention herbicides like glyphosate or Roundup. While it doesn't kill the bees, they've proven that it hampers drones and queens' reproductive viability. So even though it doesn't kill the hive right away like a insecticide would, or it can really kill the hive long term, because you've got drones that are going to go out there and mate that are not as reproductive for the queen. So and then also the queens themselves, they have a organ in their body. Once they mate, they don't ever go out and mate again. They have an organ called a spermatheca. They store that sperm in their body for the rest of their life to be able to produce those fertilized worker eggs. If they come in contact with herbicides such as Roundup or glyphosate, they can actually kill off some of that sperm, so that she's less viable for the long term, meaning that she may have to be replaced sooner. And so that's some of the things we encounter. The other thing is, of course, nutrition. As beekeepers, I mentioned, we try to leave on enough honey for our bees, but sometimes we do have to supplement them with pollen substitutes and also sugar syrup. Some locations, due to the fact that in an urban setting, yes, there's some ornamental plantings and bushes, but a lot of people want that greenhouse or that putting green yard there, and it's just there's no weeds out there, and the weeds like dandelions and henbit and purple nettle that would typically be in lawns are not there. So now you have a lack of forage and good nutrition, or a variety of nutrition. So let those weeds grow. Planting shrubs and trees that are beneficial to bees and other pollinators are good, because now you've got forage. So the nutrition side of it, we know, is another part of the whole CCD thing. So if you want to think about it as 3 or 4 parts there, we've got the mites, we've got the nutrition and forage, and then we've also got chemicals, whether it's farmers putting it out, whether it's homeowners putting it out. We've got all those things to sort of combat. So the one thing that we can sort of help out with is supplemental feeding, and also managing some of those mite levels. That way we don't have as big of issue.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Now, I don't know if you can turn so the camera can see you. There is a big bee.
Carpenter bee,
yep,
yeah.
On this side. So obviously the carpenter bee and the honeybees don't seem to have any issue with each other. So can you maybe talk about the differences between these bees, why it's beneficial to have them around, you know, anything like that?
I know carpenter bees, like this little gal or guy on my shoulder, a lot of times you'll see them out at fence lines, and you'll see that bee. It's just like following you around. It's right in your face. The male carpenter bee is almost completely blind, so he just sees that motion and is just following you. So a lot of times people see that carpenter bee, and it's the male carpenter bee. The females, unfortunately, they bore into wooden structures. So if you've got decks and wooden soffits and wooden siding, a lot of times that's their natural nesting area. They usually don't compromise the structural integrity. That's the good thing, because they don't bore. They bore horizontally versus vertically, so they don't typically hurt the structure too bad unless there's just a lot of them there. They are solitary nesters versus in a honeybee colony. We mentioned there's probably 30 to 60,000 bees, depending on the time of the year. With these bees, it's a single adult goes back in there and lays eggs, puts pollen and some nectary source in there, and creates another cavity, and then lays another egg. So what you end up with is this little cavity, and there's eggs with food sealed off, so that they can then hatch and turn into adults. We mentioned that honeybees don't hibernate. They stay in the hive all year long. The solitary bee species like carpenter bees and ground nesting bees, such as miner bees or mason bees, they have a shorter adult lifespan, but then they're solitary. They don't have a huge colony of carpenter bees in there. It's just one adult packing that hole with the resources for those developing larvae that'll eventually hatch out and become adults, and then they'll have at least one female that will become mated, and she'll hibernate over the winter, versus the bees that don't. One thing about that with miner bees and sometimes carpenter bees is it sometimes seems like there's a lot of them there. They tend to congregate and make nests, even though it's individuals in the same area. So a lot of times we'll have calls for miner bees, which are a little bit smaller than honeybees, but look, they're still fuzzy little bee, but they're digging into mud banks. It looks like there's hundreds of them there, but it's hundreds of single bees, and they've all got their individual holes. But there's lots of native bee species out there, from leaf cutting species, sweat bees, mason bees, and orchard bees. There's a lot of native bee species that are real specific on the crops that they pollinate, versus honeybees, which pollinate a wide range of stuff. Some of these native pollinators, such as like the squash bee, are actually more productive at those particular crops than, say, honeybees. So some of our native bee species, even though they're not the rock stars that the honeybees are, the honeybees get all the get all the publicity. A lot of these native bee species that are out there are actually just as big a workhorse, and a lot of them are far better at doing certain crops. And we're just a regular little bee paradise over here. There's a sweat bee that landed on my hand. So we've got all these bees. For the most part, any of these native bee species being around, you could put mason bee hives or mason bee houses. Those are the little houses either with wooden dowels in it or little bamboo shoots. You can locate them near honeybee hives. The honeybees are not going to be an issue for them, and they're not going to be an issue for the honeybees. So a lot of these native bee species coexist in areas where the honeybees are found or where beekeepers have their hives located.
That was perfect. All right, well, thank you so
Yes,
much,
ma'am.
Burton, for coming out and talking to our virtual visitors for Bug Week. I hope that they've all learned a lot about the different kinds of bees and how important beekeeping is and honeybees are to pollination, to our crops, and to ourselves.
Yep.
So we look forward to seeing you guys back here when we are live and in person again. And until then, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
All right, that was all.